Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the business of football, also known as soccer, depending on which side of the Atlantic you live. And soccer is the biggest sport in the world in terms of participation. There are billions of people that play soccer on a daily basis, and it's also the biggest sport in terms of the number of people that watch it. And the English Premier League is the biggest league anywhere around the globe. It's watched in more than 1 billion homes in over 189 countries. And that means that those clubs are making a huge amount of money. And over the last 30 or 40 years, the English Premier League has seen a huge change in terms of its ownership. And the vast majority of English Premier League clubs today are owned by overseas businessmen and investment funds. Now, some of those businessmen are buying into these clubs to make a profit. They're looking to build up the franchise, make it more established, and then exit to make money for themselves. But others are looking to win trophies. They're investing heavily into both the facilities and the clubs in order to become the biggest and the best. And the biggest and the best club in the world at the moment is Manchester City. They recently won the English Premier League for the 4th consecutive year, and they also won the World Club Championship. So that officially means that they're the best club in the world. Well, that's what they would say anyway. But in today's video, I want to talk about the economics of the Premier League, because the Premier League has tried to introduce rules to make it fair. They don't want the richest club just winning everything year after year, buying all of the best players and dominating. They want to make the league competitive, and so they've installed rules to try to limit the amount of cash that overseas investors can actually put into clubs to stop them becoming dominant. But Manchester City don't like that idea. They've actually said that it's anti-competitive. And they've now brought a case against the Premier League about anti-competitiveness. And that hearing is ongoing right now. And if Manchester City win that hearing, then it's likely that we could see the rules of the game being thrown out the window, and we could see an enormous amount of money being pumped into a small number of clubs. So in today's video, we'll have a look at some of the astonishing figures generated by the Premier League. We'll look at what the average wage bill is for some of these players, how much revenue the clubs are generating, whether or not any of them are making a profit or if they're just banking huge losses. We'll have a look at the debt situation of these clubs. We'll then talk about the rules that the Premier League have introduced to try to make it fair, the financial fair play rules. We'll talk about the point deductions that were applied against 2 of the clubs this season, Everton and Nottingham Forest, and why no point deductions were applied against some of the richer clubs such as Manchester City and Chelsea that have been spending an absolute fortune on their players. We'll then talk about the case that Manchester City has brought against the Premier League. We'll look at some of Manchester City's figures. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen in terms of that court case, and also the 115 charges that the Premier League have brought against Manchester City for not complying with their fair play rules. And I'll tell you what I think is likely to happen and what the implications of all of this could be for the future of the English Premier League and also for soccer around the world. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, thank you for the time and effort you've taken to do that. Really, really appreciate it. And if you've signed up as a long-term supporter, either through Patreon, where you can get early access to my videos and also watch them advert-free, or buy me a coffee membership or YouTube membership where you'll also get early access, thank you for that long-term support. Really helps to keep me going. Helps me think up more ideas for videos and post on a regular basis, so thanks. The English Premier League is the biggest and most lucrative soccer league in the whole of the world, and as a result, it's attracting in investment from all around the world. This table shows the total revenue earned by each Premier League football club in the 2022 and 2023 seasons. The season that ended in May 22 is shown in red, and May 23 is shown in black. So if we just look at the most recent figures, you can see that Bournemouth earned the least out of the 20 clubs at £141 million, which is around $185 million, and Manchester City earned the most at £713 million, which is around $925 million. And this chart shows the breakdown of where the clubs earn that revenue from. The red section at the bottom is the match day income, so that's the amount of money that the clubs are making from selling tickets and all the associated things like pies and pints of beer and those sort of things. The black section are TV broadcast deals, so that's the money that they're getting from being shown on television. And the green section at the top are commercial deals, which are predominantly sponsorships by brands that want to be associated with each club. And what this breakdown shows is that for 14 out of the 20 clubs, the vast majority of their earnings comes from the TV broadcast deal. The black section is by far the most dominant. However, for the remaining 6 clubs, which generally speaking are more successful and therefore have more commercial appeal, but also have wealthier owners, the balance is very different. In 2023 for Arsenal and Chelsea, the biggest form of revenue was TV rights. However, a very close second were the commercial deals that they agreed with various companies. But for the remaining 4 clubs, Tottenham, Liverpool, Manchester United and Manchester City, the single biggest source of income was commercial deals. And it's these commercial deals that are controversial and are causing issues with the Premier League, because the Premier League is concerned that some of the businesses that are sponsoring the clubs are related to the ownership of the club itself. So if an owner has a business and that business decides that it wants to sponsor the club, there is an intrinsic relationship, a conflict of interest. And the Premier League wants to make sure that all of those deals are being done on a fair market value, that basically they're not inflating the value of those deals just to put more money into the club in order to buy more players and pay them higher wages. This chart shows the total wage bill for the 20 English Premier League clubs for the 22 and 23 seasons. And once again, if we focus in on the black bars here, you can see the club with the lowest wage bill was Brentford, who paid its players and staff a combined total of £99 million, which is around $130. However, Manchester City paid its players and staff a combined total of £423 million, which is around $550 million. So we've got a huge difference in terms of the wages that these clubs are paying. And this chart shows the average weekly wages that the clubs are paying to players. And you can see that the lowest ranked club here is Brentford, with an average weekly wage of £45,000, which means that on average the Brentford players were paid £2.3 million each, or around $3 million. However, the average weekly wage at Manchester City was £196,000, which equates to £10 million on an annual basis, which is around $13 million. So you can see that there is a huge difference in the wage bills and the amount that each club is paying the players. And obviously that means that they're attracting in a much higher standard of player if you're prepared to pay £10 million per year rather than £2 million. This chart shows the total wage bill for each club as a percentage of their total revenue. So this really gives us a flavour as to whether or not the wage bill is sustainable. And what we can see here is that there's a big difference between the clubs. The club with the lowest wage bill as a percentage of its income is Tottenham, which is interesting because Tottenham was actually ranked as the club with the 16th highest wage bill, with an average wage of £6 million per player. But it had the 17th highest revenue of all of the clubs. And this was also the first club that we looked at that had higher commercial income than TV broadcast income. And I think it's also interesting to note that Manchester City, that had by far the highest wage bill, is ranked at number 6 on this table, and its wages as a percentage of income are coming in at 59%, which is exactly the same percentage as Brentford, that was ranked as the club with the lowest wage bill. And if we look at the far right-hand side of this chart, you can see that Leicester's wages as a percentage of income was actually 116%. So the wage bill was more than its total revenue. This table records whether or not the clubs made a profit or a loss in the season ending May 2023. And what this shows is that only 3 out of the 20 clubs actually recorded a profit. Bournemouth's year-end result was a £44 million profit. Manchester City recorded an £80 million profit, and Brighton and Hove Albion recorded the highest profit at £133 million. And every other club recorded a loss, with Brentford coming in with the smallest loss, and interestingly, they had the smallest wage bill, and Manchester United recording the highest loss at £150 million. Now, one of the key elements in terms of the accounts of football clubs is what they do with their players, because players are traded. If you sell a player who's still in contract, then you're entitled to a fee for that player. And all of the English Premier League clubs buy and sell players every single season, and this can determine whether or not you make a profit or a loss. And this chart shows the same figures that we just looked at, but excludes the player trading. So basically, it takes out any profits that the club have been making from selling players. And what this shows is that only one club actually made a real profit without any player trading. And interestingly, that was Brentford, the club with the lowest wage bill. Manchester City, who we'll come on to talk about in more detail later in the video, recorded a loss of £36 million. But by far the biggest loss out of all of the English Premier League clubs in the 2023 season was recorded by Chelsea, excluding player transfers, who recorded a loss of £249 million. And the final statistic that I'd like to look at in this section is the net debt that these clubs have. Which clubs have borrowed the most in order to fund their businesses? And what this chart shows is that there are only 3 clubs that don't have any debt. Aston Villa has a neutral position, Manchester City has a net cash position, and the club with the highest amount of cash and no debt is Fulham with £51 million. And if we look at the other end of the spectrum, you can see that the 2 clubs with the most debt out of all of the English Premier League clubs are Manchester United with £663 million and Tottenham with £670 million. And the reason that I wanted to show this is that obviously if you're building up debt, there is a risk that something will happen with that debt at some point in the future. If your revenue falls or your costs increase, then you run the risk of posting losses. And at some point, those debt providers may decide that they need to be paid back, and that potentially puts the club at the risk of failure in the same way as any other business with large amounts of debt runs that risk. Now, as I said at the start of today's video, the English Premier League applies rules against all of the clubs to try to make it a level playing field. As much as possible, they're trying to avoid a situation where a rich owner can just pump billions of pounds into the club, buy all the best players in the world, and dominate the league. They want the league to be as competitive as possible. And one of the main ways that the Premier League tries to do this is through what's called the Profit and Sustainability Rule. And this rule says that no club can make a loss of more than £105 million in a 3-year period. And this chart shows how that figure has been put together. The blue section at the bottom represents the average loss that a club is allowed to have over a 3-year period, and you can see that that's £5 million. So in total, over a 3-year period, you can record a £15 million loss. That's seen as being acceptable. But in addition to that, you can also record an additional loss of £30 million, providing you can show that you have secure funding to cover that loss. So basically, your owner can put in £30 million of their own money to cover that loss. So in total, over a 3-year period, you can record a loss of £35 million per season, which means that in total, you can declare a loss of £115 million. So this system relies upon the clubs submitting their audited accounts that have been signed off by an independent auditor, and the Premier League then looks at those accounts and checks off to see whether or not they've met the rules. And in the most recent season, Everton submitted accounts that showed that they'd lost an additional £16.6 million, and as a result of that they were deducted 10 points, which was subsequently reduced to a 6-point deduction upon appeal. And alongside Everton's point deduction, Nottingham Forest also were hit with the points deduction as a result of their financial results. Now, the Nottingham Forest position was actually more complicated because they hadn't spent 3 full years in the Premier League. They'd actually been promoted to the Premier League from the Championship, the league below it. And so they were only allowed to make a maximum loss of 61 million. Nottingham Forest breached that, and as a result of that, they were hit with a points deduction. So this is the main system through which the Premier League is trying to create a level playing field. But unfortunately, one of the things that you're able to do if you want to bend the rules is increase the amount that you're being paid by your sponsors if those sponsors are potentially linked to your ownership, or if you just strike a very good deal. Following the takeover of Newcastle United by the Saudi Public Investment Fund in October 2021, the Premier League called an emergency meeting because it was concerned that the new owners would find loopholes in the system in order to provide Newcastle with large sponsorship deals from associated parties to boost the revenue of Newcastle and therefore enable them to be able to buy the best players in the world and become the best club. Now, at that emergency meeting, the Premier League held a vote amongst the 20 Premier League clubs and asked them to introduce a new system called associated party transactions, whereby the Premier League would determine whether or not a deal that had been agreed with an associated party was fair and had been done at market value. And if they didn't agree with that, then it was going to be disallowed. Now, interestingly, as part of that vote, Newcastle United voted against it, obviously, because it had been brought in specifically to stop them from raising more money to buy players. Manchester City abstained, and every single other Premier League club voted in favour of it. So the Premier League then introduced its associated party transaction rules. And what this is designed to do is prevent the backdoor way of boosting your revenue so that you can then buy more and more expensive players. But this is now a bone of contention, and Manchester City have now submitted a 165-page report against the Premier League saying that these associated party transaction rules are anti-competitive. They're actually stopping clubs like Manchester City from agreeing very lucrative deals with the parties that want to sponsor them. This table shows the 10 largest sponsorship deals that were agreed for the 2023-24 season across the European clubs. And this is for the main shirt sponsor, so basically the brand name that appears across all of the players' chests when they're playing matches. And you can see that the biggest deal that was put into place for last season was for Atletico Madrid in Spain, and they're being paid €40 million, which is around $45 million per season on a 4-year contract. The second biggest deal was for Newcastle United, which was from a sponsor called Seller, which is actually related to its new owners, and that deal is for €29.3 million per season over a 3-year period. The third largest new contract was for Aston Villa at €14.2 million, and the fourth was for Fulham at 11.7. Now, in terms of determining whether or not these are fair figures, let's have a look at some of the biggest deals that are in place. This table shows the largest deals that are currently in place for the biggest teams in Europe. And you can see that Barcelona sits right at the top of this list, and Spotify is paying Barcelona €70 million per season. Second on the list is Real Madrid, who are also being paid €70 million per season by Emirates. A close third is Paris Saint-Germain from the French League, who are being paid €68.5 million per season by Qatar Airways. The fourth biggest deal has been agreed by Manchester City, who are being paid €66.5 million per season by Etihad. Liverpool are being paid €58.6 million by Standard Chartered, Arsenal $58.4 by Emirates, Manchester United €55.1 by Team Viewer, Bayern Munich €50 million by T-Mobile, Tottenham €46.9 million by AIA, and Juventus €45 million by Jeep. As we saw from the data earlier, Manchester City have not breached any of the profit and sustainability rules put in place by the Premier League. However, they are facing 115 charges as a result of various financial breaches. These charges relate to alleged breaches in the 9 years between 2009 and 2018, including 54 alleged breaches for failure to provide accurate and up-to-date financial information from the 2009-10 season to the 2017-18 season, 35 alleged breaches for failure to cooperate with Premier League investigations from December 2018, 14 alleged breaches for failure to provide accurate financial reports for player and manager compensation from 2009-10 to 2017-18, 7 alleged breaches of Premier League profitability and sustainability regulations from 2015-16 up to and including 2017-18, and 5 alleged breaches for failure to comply with UEFA regulations, including UEFA club licensing and financial fair play regulations. Now, these charges were actually announced against Manchester City in February 2023, and as it stands at the moment, no date has formally been set for the official hearing. There's been reported in the press that potentially it might take place in November 2024, but nothing official has been confirmed by the Premier League. And these hearings are behind closed doors. They don't allow any cameras in, there's no press coverage, so we won't find out what actually the result of this hearing is until it's concluded. But interestingly, Manchester City have hired one of the most expensive barristers in the world, and this is a guy that's represented them on previous occasions and has won their case. And it's reported that he costs £10,000 per day for his time, but I'm sure it'll be worth it if Manchester City can get off with these 115 charges. But interestingly, in retaliation against these 115 charges, Manchester City are now suing the Premier League. Manchester City have launched legal action against the Premier League, saying that its associated party transaction rules are anti-competitive and are actually discriminative against clubs with Middle Eastern owners. And Manchester City have gone on to say that they are now losing money as a result of the fact that they can't agree these large deals with their potential commercial partners, and so they are now suing the Premier League for loss of earnings. And I think this is a really interesting topic because Manchester City, as I said right at the beginning of this video, are the most successful club in the world in world football at the moment. And so you would expect that they could agree the best commercial deals. But as we saw, they're not ranked as number one in terms of the amount that they're making from their main shirt sponsor. And so there is a logic to say that if you're the biggest and the best, you should be getting the biggest and the best deals. And it might be that you come up with a groundbreaking deal. It could be double or treble that from all of the other clubs. Now, as it stands at the moment, the Premier League would probably reject that deal and say that it doesn't meet with their associated party transaction rules because it's out of kilter with everybody else. But if you're setting new boundaries, if you're breaking the mould, then obviously you're going to get a deal that doesn't look like everybody else's deal. And that's really Manchester City's point, that they shouldn't be held back. If they can find a commercial deal, whether it's related at all to their current owners, they should be able to sign that deal and bring more money in. And that would then enable them to buy even more players, pay them even more wages, and dominate football even further. So that's what the Premier League is trying to stop them doing, but Manchester City have hired the best legal team in the world to try to win this case. And if they do, this could blow the whole of the financial fair play system out of the water. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening in the world of sport is a really interesting part of the world of business. As populations age, people have more free time and more disposable income, and watching sport is becoming a bigger thing. And that's drawing in more commercial activities, more sponsorship, and more interest from owners from overseas. And what we've talked about in today's video is that the English Premier League, which is now the biggest sporting league globally, has attracted in investment from all around the world. A lot of businessmen want to be involved in these clubs. Some of them want to be involved to try to make money for themselves, and others want to do it as more of a plaything. If you're an ultra-wealthy billionaire, it's nice to have your own sports club to be able to brag about, to see whether or not you can beat all of your other friends who also own sports clubs. That's sort of the way things are going. But what I wanted to get into the detail in on today's video is what the details look like on the Premier League. How much these clubs are making in terms of revenue, how much they're paying out in terms of wages, whether or not they're making a profit, and how the clubs are being controlled in terms of trying to keep it competitive, trying to make it so that the teams at the bottom of the league can actually beat some of the teams at the top. And what we've seen from the details of today's video is that there is a huge spectrum in the English Premier League. We've got some clubs, a very small number, that are actually making a profit, so they're taking in more revenue than they're spending, and we've got the vast majority of the clubs who are banking huge losses. They're paying out tens and hundreds of millions of pounds per year in wages, and they're not actually making enough revenue to cover that. Now, in the English Premier League, there is a way of balancing the books. You can actually trade players for cash. So you can sell a player if you need to bring some money in. And that's what a lot of the clubs have been doing. But one of the problems that you have is that if you want to build a team that's going to be successful, you have to be on the other side of that transaction. You actually have to be buying players. And if you're buying a lot of players, obviously that goes as a negative in terms of your profit and loss. So it's very difficult to be able to balance the books in terms of building a successful team without breaking the rules. And one of the ways that some of the clubs have been doing that is by signing commercial deals. And we saw from the data that there are 4 clubs that are now earning more money from commercial deals than they are from TV rights and matchday revenue. And that's becoming a bigger and bigger part of the business. And one of the problems from the Premier League's point of view is monitoring those deals to make sure they are what they deem to be fair, that clubs are not agreeing special arrangements with their owners whereby the owner suddenly provides a huge sponsorship deal which gives them a huge amount of revenue, which means that they can buy more players, pay them higher wages and win the league year after year. And that's one of the accusations that have been made against Manchester City by a lot of other supporters over the last few years, that they've simply bought up all the best players, paying them a lot more than everybody else can afford because they've got this special arrangement with their Middle Eastern owners. And interestingly, the Premier League has now brought 115 charges against Manchester City, the majority of which have been for the non-provision of information that the Premier League has been looking for. So they're saying that Manchester City haven't actually breached the rules, so they're not going to get a points deduction automatically in the same way that Everton and Nottingham Forest did. They submitted accounts that said, we're really sorry we breached the rules, we didn't mean to, and so they were hit with points deductions. Man City haven't done that, but what they're accused of doing is not giving enough information to the Premier League. And so the Premier League is now taking them to court, and they're going to decide upon their decision at some point later this year. It might be November. We don't know exactly when it's going to be. But in advance of that, Manchester City are saying, actually, we don't care about the accusations you've made against us. We are taking you to arbitration and we are charging you with anti-competitiveness. You're holding Manchester City back by preventing us from signing really big commercial deals with companies that may or may not be related to our owners. That is anti-competitive. And if Manchester City win that case, then the Premier League will have to abandon its associated party transaction rules, which means that all of the clubs that have super rich owners would then be in a position where they could set up commercial deals for their club, which would potentially increase the revenue hugely and increase the amount of players that those clubs could sign, pay them higher wages. And what we would then see is a further differentiation in the English Premier League. We've already got a situation where there are a small number of super rich clubs who tend to buy up all of the best players and tend to come in the top 5 or 6 positions every single year. If the associated party transaction rules are abandoned as a result of this case brought by Manchester City, then that would mean that those rich clubs would be able to go further away from the rest of the league, and we would see a 2-tier system. We'd have 5 or 6 clubs at the top who would dominate every single season, and then the rest of the clubs. And I think that would be a shame in terms of the competitiveness, because one of the exciting things about the English Premier League today is that we do get situations where teams at the bottom are beating teams at the top. It does happen every single season. But if we don't have rules put in place that limit the amount of players and how much they're allowed to pay all of those players from the club side of things, then that potentially means that the bigger clubs will get stronger and stronger, and it would be less likely that the clubs towards the bottom of the league would have a chance of beating them. And what that would essentially leave is a mini league at the top, where it's only really the games where the big clubs are playing each other that are going to make a difference in terms of the end of the season outcome. So the overall summary of today's video is that the English Premier League is now huge business. We are talking billions of dollars of turnover every single year. The Premier League is trying to make the league as fair as possible. It's got rules in place that try to limit the amount of cash that owners can pump into their businesses. Manchester City are currently challenging those rules. If they win that case, then the Premier League will have to abandon its associated party transaction rules, which would leave the door wide open for those owners to start putting even more money into the big clubs. And that would potentially mean that the level of competition in the Premier League will reduce as the bigger clubs get bigger and the smaller clubs get smaller. So hopefully you've enjoyed this slightly different version of my video today. You found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you have liked what I said, then please give me a thumbs up and let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see me posting more sporting videos. But thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.